Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is retired U.S. Army Major General John Davis, who is the Vice President for the public sector for Palo Alto Networks, where he is responsible for expanding cybersecurity initiatives and global policy for the international public sector and assisting governments around the world to prevent successful cyber breaches. Prior to joining Palo Alto Networks, John served as the Senior Military Advisor for Cyber to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and also served as the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy. Prior to this assignment, he served in multiple leadership positions in Special Operations, Cyber, and Information Operations. John earned a Master of Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College, Master of Military Art and Science from the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, and a Bachelor of Science from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. General John Davis, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thank you very much for the invitation to do this. I'm really looking forward to it.
I wanted to start this off and flip things around a little bit. Frequently, these types of questions are saved for the end. But you have been a part of the military information operations community for quite some time, since at least the mid-1990s. I am curious, what advice would you give to a young military information operations professional who is just getting started on his or her career?
Well, thanks, John. And that is a great question. And I've got quite a bit to say about it. I'd like to give you my view of the reality of what their profession means today, and then I'll give a piece of what I think will be important advice. But let me start by saying congratulations, you're now on the front lines in modern warfare. And let me take just a couple of minutes to explain why it's really important to believe what I'm saying about the front lines in modern warfare. I'm not trying to be cute, and it's not hyperbole in my view. I mean, look at what's happening. Our adversaries have long realized that they don't want to take on the U.S. and its partners and allies in traditional armed conflict. They know it would be very costly, and they likely conclude that they would lose. I'm certainly not advocating for doing away with traditional warfare capabilities, but I do think there's a growing possibility that just like nuclear capabilities, while we need to have them, their use will become more rare in the future. But look at what else has been happening over the past several years. In recent history, there's been little cost and a great deal of benefit associated with our adversaries' decision to employ offensive information warfare, including cyber operations, for relatively limited purposes. If you look back over the past decade or so, we've seen these kinds of operations employed against us in a number of variations. Let me give you some familiar examples. Espionage activities to enable other offensive information operations, including using the result of the espionage activities to enable disinformation, misinformation, distortion of messages to fit in the extreme agenda for divisiveness, weaponization of social media forums, and capabilities to create or exaggerate division, as already seen in the case of Russia against the US and other Western democracies, and now increasingly seen from China, Iran, even North Korea. And there are other operations, reconnaissance and pre-positioning for future effects, like was done with the Black Energy bot in our electric grid systems, testing for effectiveness on small scale to gauge a reaction from a targeted country, like the cyber breach of a small New York dam is one example, and even other operations designed to do things like creating social chaos and undermining Western democratic institutions. You've got the Russian activities during the US 2016 election and Brexit, just two examples there. Raising funds to circumvent sanctions, Ransomware is one example by North Korea. Sending messages and signaling. The Iranian distributed denial of service on US financial sector and the Sands Hotel disruptions are two examples. And you even have stealing of intellectual property, with China being the largest example, or research, and COVID-19 vaccine is a current example, stealing this property for profit or advantage. And the list goes on and on. What's important to understand is these types of operations have become especially attractive in recent years for adversaries that want to operate in what we call the gray zone. They operate in this space because they see tremendous advantage over the US and Western democratic countries, as opposed to fighting in the traditional physical dimensions where, as I mentioned before, they likely conclude they would lose under some very costly circumstances. But by operating in these ways below the traditional threshold, a threshold that used to result in a targeted country's determination that an adversary's actions had clearly crossed a red line that constituted use of force or armed aggression or hostile acts. But by staying below that threshold, adversaries have been able to frustrate targeted countries' responses. They've also seen tremendous effect at leveraging these types of information warfare operations in order to sow fear, uncertainty, divisiveness, and undermine the fabric of democratic societies. I mean, and by the way, you take a look at this, the impact of this deadly global pandemic, add to it severe world economic instability across many sectors of industry, and then on top of that, pour some, recently inflamed racial tensions on top of a historically divided society with many within many Western democracies. And you got a historical opportunity for our adversaries to gain an advantage over those democracies. I mean, truth has never been put into more doubt, while selective truth and distortion to fit extreme agendas and vastly different worldviews on both sides of political and cultural divides has never been more powerful. I believe that Western nations are experiencing a time of great risk to national and international security, to economic viability, and even public safety and societal stability. Our adversaries know this and are positioning themselves to gain advantage with great urgency by using many of the things that I just described throughout the fertile digital environment of social media and other traditional types of media. I don't know if it's an existential problem, but it's certainly a situation where adversaries recognize that they have a significant opportunity for repositioning advantage and relative power among nations, and influencing Western domestic publics to cause both extremist sides of cultural and political divisions to demonize each other instead of recognizing the real foreign enemies behind many of these activities in some cases, and at least boosting them in other cases. It's an extremely powerful tool empowered by today's digital age. So that's why I mean what I say about being on the front lines in modern warfare. I'm deadly serious, and I think that our national security, our economic competitiveness, and even our public health and safety is on the line. Now, the piece of advice that I would offer, if I may, it's about trust and credibility. And I think this will be absolutely critical to your success. A little history about my experience in special ops. When I graduated from the military academy in 1980 and joined the infantry, although its history long preceded the 80s, special operations were just beginning to really take hold in our military. And unfortunately, it was because of a national catastrophe and an embarrassment, Operation Eagle Claw and the failed attempt to rescue the US hostages in Iran in April of that same year. Prior to that mission, the traditional military viewed special operations with much suspicion and even contempt in some cases. And as a result of the mission failure, Congress essentially took the operational role of special operations away from the services, who had really never given it as much priority or respect as it deserved, and created US Special Operations Command. And this was largely against the will of the services. This was a necessary step, in my view, in building the kind of world-class capability the nation needed. but the level of suspicion and resentment among the services continued for many, many years. And only through the dedication, professionalism, and I would say slow buildup of trust and credibility of our special operations forces did we overcome those legacy views of dismissal or suspicion. And after 9/11, the nation had what it needed to address the threats at the time, and special operations became really the standard bearer in many ways for much of the rest of the US military, as reflected in the way that, traditional Army and Marine Corps units transformed to operate in the counterterrorism and counterinsurgency environments. I think that same trust and credibility required to make the special operations community the capability that our country needed in the past is what the information warfare community must strive to achieve today. Information warfare professionals are looked at with varying degrees of suspicion, dismissal, ignorance about what you can and can't do, and no service, in my view, has yet invested the priority and resources required to elevate the information warfare community to what the nation needs to fight on the front lines in modern warfare. You have to earn that trust each day. And I would submit the first priority you should focus on is learning how to build trusted relationships. What you will be required to do to be effective requires teamwork across many different tribes, if you will, and requires the approval of many different levels of leadership that may not understand the magnitude of what you're doing as well as they should. You will be coordinators, not owners of capabilities. You must master the integration of various information related capabilities required to achieve a position of advantage against our adversaries. You must be seen as a trusted and credible professional who can deliver real outcomes. Nothing is more important to your success, in my view. Nothing.
Thanks for your perspective and setting the stage there. I heard you speak one other time and you went into a little bit of detail. I'm hoping you can do so quickly here as well. Leaders are no longer the keepers of all knowledge. Information is flowing so fast these days. Military service members have their devices, their phones, which they're sending and receiving information. And the bottom line, the lieutenant colonel, the battalion commander is no longer the one who receives information and disseminates it, but now that information is coming in different velocities and different messages to people all over the unit. Could you talk for just a moment as to how that changes the way mid to senior leaders need to adopt maybe a new management style or a new outlook in order to help lead their unit today compared to 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
Yeah, sure thing, John. And I mean, I think what you're referring to is I said, as leaders, you're no longer the smartest person in the room.
That's exactly it. Yes.
Exactly. It's exactly what you said. Information is so widely available at all levels with speed and scale that is just unimaginable. And so the dynamics are very different today. So while I truly believe there are some aspects of leadership that are evergreen, they'll never change, having leadership that's based in values, understanding what's important, having a vision, articulating and enforcing that vision, being able to sort out, the priorities in a way that are after the organizational goals, not your personal goals. There are a lot of things that are evergreen and will never change. But for me, at least in today's world, some things have changed about leadership. I think transparency has never been more important as a leader. Because you can't avoid it. You just cannot avoid it. You are more exposed, might be a bad word, but you're more exposed than you ever have been in the past. And you need to understand that. Humility. I think humility is a great characteristic of modern leaders. They kind of like Dirty Harry said, a man's got to know his limitations. And,
Mm-hmm.
and so, being willing to say you don't know the answer and listening to your subordinates, taking that kind of input, admitting when you're wrong, but taking the corrective action and accepting some failures and moving on quickly. Those are aspects that I think are extremely important today. And so I do think that the information age has changed some dynamics about what the true characteristics of leadership require today. Although there are some that don't change, I think the information age has brought in a few that we need to pay attention to as leaders.
Thanks for that. So let's continue on into our discussion here. There is a lot of criticism being bandied about these days about the way America tends to approach the information problem and cognitive security in general. It's not difficult to find articles on the internet that are critical about the set of circumstances that we find ourselves in. But I'd like to flip that around too. So what in your opinion has America done well historically relative to the information environment, and what is America doing right today?
I'd start by saying America's not doing enough right today because of some of the things that I spoke about earlier. But I think there's a growing recognition of the importance of concepts like information warfare and what our adversaries are doing in that space. But sometimes we can't seem to get out of our own way. But I would say if you look back through our history of warfare as a nation, I mean, right to the very beginning with George Washington, we were very good at certain functions associated with what we now call information warfare. In this case, deception and operation security, some of the functions that General Washington used to great effect. I believe we were at the height of our information warfare with the capabilities of the time during World War II, and even during the Cold War at a strategic level. Even though we didn't call it information warfare. Information warfare during those examples was the supreme integration of all the levers of power we had at our disposal to achieve a position of advantage over our adversaries, and usually with some healthy help from our partners and allies. One case, World War II in a traditional war, and one case, the Cold War, and what I would call warfare, but not traditional war, more like political warfare or economic warfare. In my personal experiences, I think we tend to do better at information warfare when we stay in the shadows, especially on the offensive side. That was the case in World War II by the OSS, the precursor to special operations in the CIA. I think JSOC is a good modern example, but that's increasingly hard to do today for a number of reasons. In my experience, the larger the military involvement needed, and the broader the effort required, the more resistance we encounter from if you will, a roles, responsibilities, and equities perspective among the different segments of our deliberately divided form of government. And that's why it's relatively easier for Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea to do these kinds of things. There's not a lot of infighting between the tribes, if you will, and not much of a separation of powers dynamic going on in those more autocratic forms of government. And at least from my personal history, we can avoid many of those fights when we stay in the shadows as much as possible. Though, I'll admit there is certainly a role for open, overt action as well in some cases. We were able to achieve some great successes, I think, in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially in the special operations community, and in places other than just Iraq and Afghanistan, by the way, although you'll never read about them in the media. And many of the investigative journalists who have tried to cover these things never quite get the whole story right, thankfully. In my view, I'll admit it's only a thin veil of secrecy, but it's enough to protect forces, capabilities, tactics, techniques, and procedures, and keeping the continued ability to outmaneuver our adversaries in the information environment, which gives our forces and missions a position of advantage, and not lose them immediately after they are uncovered in the public eye. This is where I would say we had some limited successes in presenting the cognitive security problem for our adversaries.
Right. And let's just stick with that cognitive security. So I want to take the remainder of our time to examine cognitive security from a private industry, corporate vantage, compared to national security and government vantage. But first, I think it might be helpful to define terms. Cognitive security, if you ask 10 different experts, you might get 10 slightly different definitions of what cognitive security means. Could you take a moment and tell us what you think about when you think of cognitive security?
Sure thing, John. I'd say the best way I can think of describing it, like I would for my nieces and nephews who don't know much about this, by saying, don't be fooled. I think this applies to you as a person as well as you as an organization. I mean, listen, I was in the information warfare community from the mid 90s until I really began to focus mostly on the cyber portion of information warfare in 2008. And one thing that plagued us back then, and I think continues to plague us today, is what I'll call term warfare. That's what I mean when I said earlier, we can't seem to get out of our own way. We argue over terms. Historically, we've argued in this arena over command and control warfare, information operations, what capabilities and functions are included in information operations, who owns what and gets what resources and priorities. And by the way, most of the term warfare fights are over resources. My advice to anybody who will listen is to forget about the term warfare dynamic. It's really a red herring. I believe it's truly information warfare. And while we're not in the traditional war with the modern threats, we are in a form of warfare, whether that term rubs you the wrong way or not, just like political or economic warfare, as I said earlier. But instead of calling the broader term information warfare or information operations, I just call it what it is. It's modern warfare. And the common objective across every single function or capability involved in this modern form of warfare, including cognitive security, is to create and maintain a position of advantage over your adversary. That's what each of our adversaries are doing that to us right now. And in my opinion, we're losing badly in some cases. In terms of cognitive security, that's why I say it's about not being fooled, which is the aim of both adversaries and industry as well, by the way. Yes, your device is listening to you, but it's not the US government unless you're doing something very wrong and there's a warrant out to surveil you. It's the companies who want to sell you stuff by modifying your decisions and behavior. It can even be from politicians who want to influence your vote and support. And in many ways, marketing is a form of influence to shape your behavior. You have to be, in my view, you have to be very discerning about anything you see or hear these days. And cognitive security, to me, is best handled by a little bit of common sense and some basic research before you act. Who is really behind what you're seeing or hearing, and what are they trying to influence you to do? A bit of research, validation from various sources, a suspicious attitude about who's knocking on your digital front door before you open it up, proactively setting up your cognitive security locks, alarms, and other warning features, just like you would do to keep bad people or even solicitors from getting in your house. These things to me represent the application of cognitive security for any person or organization. And there are a lot of entities trying to fool you with increasing speed and scale because they are increasingly using automation and software-based advanced analytics, such as big data analytics, behavior analytics, structured and unstructured machine learning, neural networking, and AI. Don't be fooled, be discerning, be suspicious. I don't believe it's about being paranoid. It's just plain being smart in today's world.
Right. Would you say it's a fair analogy that at this moment we are similar to the people back in the 1400s when the printing press came online? That was a game-changing technology, and the people alive back then had to adjust to the repercussions of that new technology, just as we're having to adjust, like you were just saying, being critical, being discriminating about the information and how you process it. It's somewhat analogous.
Yeah, I think there in many ways it is, although also this dynamic has been with us in terms of war and warfare since the beginning of time, but it manifests itself in different ways through the use of technology. And I think the big difference in today's world is the speed and scale at which this stuff can be coming at you, and trying to separate real from information that is deliberately trying to distort something to get you to cause to result in a behavior a certain way out of an individual or an organization. It's getting more challenging these days because of the use of technology and automation and those software-based advanced analytics.
Right, the efficiency of information transfer, all that. So I'd like to start talking a little bit more about the compare and contrast some of the cognitive security perspectives. I'm going to paint a word picture here and ask a couple of questions, and then turn it over to you, John, to take it in whatever direction you'd like to go. But so when I think about comparing US government and commercial cognitive security, what I see is a Venn diagram with two or maybe more big overlapping circles, right? So one circle represents the US government perspective, the national security perspective, and the other is a commercial perspective. And so this kind of a simplified diagram helps us ask a number of questions and stimulate discussion. So for example, what cognitive security considerations reside within the government only portion, and why? What about the commercial or the private sector portion that is exclusive of the government portion? And perhaps most interesting, what about the overlap? What cognitive security interests reside or are evident for both the private sector and for national security? And how big is that overlap? And how has that overlap been changing over, say, the last 10 years? I would imagine that some of the items that you were mentioning a few moments ago about information sharing and separation of powers, these kinds of conversations have become a lot more vivid in recent years compared to maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. So like I said, I just want to kick that over to you and ask you to take it in whatever direction you think is fruitful.
Sure. I think you're right about the Venn diagram as a way to think about it, with some things being peculiar to one and others being common. Let me start by saying I'm sure I don't have the complete answers here, but I'll start with DoD. In my view, DoD is focused on gaining a position of advantage over adversaries in relation to national security, and you could include international security as well. The DoD view of threats is in the form of both nation-state adversaries, as well as hybrid combinations of state and non-state actors and organizations, especially when it comes to information warfare. The adversaries have learned that because of the increasingly serious consequence to national and economic security over the past years, the US and many of its partners have invested significantly in their ability to attribute the actions of states in the information environment. So you can't hide like you used to be able to. So they are increasingly leveraging, entities like front companies, surrogates, research and academic, with quotes around that, entities, criminal organizations, patriotic hackers, and even moonlighters in some cases. And this is a dangerous trend in my view. It's what I worried about more than the quote cyber Pearl Harbor or cyber 9/11 when I was the senior military cyber advisor at the Pentagon before I retired. These loosely controlled third-party actors and organizations have questionable motives and skills. As a result, I think it's increasingly likely they'll do something at either the direction or inspiration of a nation state that will escalate out of control or be mistaken by the target for their intentions. And I think that can easily escalate into more traditional forms of warfare. Industry, on the other hand, I think is looking to gain, and that was just DoD. I'm sure there would be a different, we could talk about, the Department of Commerce and Treasury and the view of the economic side of things as well. But industry, on the other hand, I think that, they're looking to gain a position of advantage for profit. And their view of threats is both their competition as well as the criminal threat. And I think increasingly today, they're worried about the nation state threat and those combinations of the two in my view. So I think one of the most important things in the overlap area is that combating disinformation and distortion requires cooperation from both sides, from both government and industry. And this is because the information environment is largely owned, operated, and maintained by industry. And in the battleground of social media, which is one of the most important areas of operation in modern warfare, governments, especially those that value privacy and civil liberties and freedom of speech, are not equipped to fight the threats without the support of industry. So that's how that's a quick look at the way I would divide up the differences as well as the similarities. And the similarities largely around the need for cooperation between the two in order to be successful against these threats.
Right. So cooperation and transparency is definitely a theme for your discussion on these topics. Do you envision a future, maybe it's already here, it's probably already happening a little bit, but a more deliberate exchange program, if you will, between private industry and government in order to help level set or in order to help increase that collaboration and partnering between the private and government side? Is that kind of thing happening, or do you think it needs to happen more, or is it about right?
Oh, I definitely think it needs to happen more, John. And, I'll go back to my military experience, and in large measure, looking at, from my time in the special operations community, we devoted a significant amount of resources at basically I'll just call it the L&O concept, the liaison officer, but it often was more than just one L&O. It was representative of a team that you would embed in all of the other organizations that you would need to partner with in order to be successful. And likewise, there would be reciprocal. You would want teams from the other organizations embedded in yours so that you understand culture, you understand process, you can deliberate more quickly on equity related issues and authority related issues and come to some type of agreement or consensus by finding the common purpose behind everybody in a team environment. I don't know if folks haven't read General McChrystal's book, Team of Teams, but that would be a great book to understand this dynamic. I think it's very important not just to do that across military organizations, but to do it anywhere that there is a cooperative effort required across a very large set of entities to be successful. This concept of embedding your capability with them and vice versa, I think is a very, very, it's a win-win, and it really does work. I have seen, I don't think there's as much of it happening in this arena as I would like to see between the public and private sectors. I have seen in my experience in my company that I work for now in the cybersecurity industry, I've seen this in the case of cyber threat intelligence sharing and being able to embed, there are programs, for example, in the services that allow them to, at a certain level for officer development, you can embed people in training with industry or education with industry, and you can, it's a way to do what you're describing. And then after spending some time in an industry threat intelligence organization, an Army officer, for example, might have a follow-on assignment in, let's say, Army Cyber Command, or maybe somewhere in US Cyber Command. and they've got a much better appreciation for the capabilities of what can happen in industry and how they can work together on towards common objectives, which is what's required for the dealing with the cyber threats we face today. It's no different, I think, for the broader set of information warfare capabilities. But once you start talking about propaganda and public affairs and media, it becomes increasingly difficult because because of the dynamic where it looks like government is doing things and operating in areas where there might be some resistance to that from the public in general. So is it needed? Yes. Do we need more? Yes. Is it easy? No, it's not easy to do that.
Right. It's certainly not easy. Our military services are, manpower is a premium all the time, not just sometimes, all the time. And carving out billets for this type of an exchange program could be challenging unless it's a legitimate exchange program where a uniformed service member, like maybe as you were describing, mid-grade officers in the middle of their career looking for a broadening opportunity to do an exchange at a private organization in exchange for somebody from that private organization filling a needed role within DoD that could be kind of a one-for-one swap, which could ease that kind of program being created in the first place. But yeah, it seems like that would be a very impactful capability for the information age. So a strong U.S. economy is powered by vibrant companies, and therefore a strong private sector is critical to national security interests. How, over time, is the information and cognitive security problem affecting policy and legal matters between, just for example, the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense? Do considerations like posse comitatus start coming into play as we start looking at the kinds of capabilities we need in order to remain competitive in the modern battle space?
Yeah, those darn implications of a democratic republic with purpose-built separation of powers. Not an easy thing to resolve sometimes. But I'd say one thing that makes a difference is how clear the threat is and the consequences of a lack of cooperation, regardless of who's in charge. And you can take a look, it might be useful to look at the terrorism issue as a stake in the ground. I believe that because 9/11 left no ambiguity over what the threat to national security was, there was swift cooperation between all agencies, not just DoD and DHS, in combating the problem of radicalization in the information environment, which was one of the ways of not just fighting the current fight, but shaping the future for a more successful outcome, i.e. less terrorists being radicalized. I would say that with DoD at the front edge of the fight, even though DHS in this case was responsible for the homeland application, in many ways a DoD lead with DHS and others supporting the effort became the norm. And over time, it became clear that massive industry cooperation was going to be required to be effective, as I stated before. And there was a role for both agencies in interacting with industry, including enlisting the help or support from social and traditional media as well. Now, fast forward to the problem of, mis and disinformation and influence of the elections and political decision-making within Western democracies. In my view, this was not something in 2016 that was nearly as unambiguous as the threat that 9/11 represented. I think this resulted in less initial cooperation and coordination between DoD and other agencies such as DHS than in the terrorism case, but it has improved. I know, as an example, DoD's Cyber National Mission Force actions during the 2018 and 2020 elections were much better supported in a more coordinated and cooperative way than in 2016. So there's some progress on that, and I think it should continue. And I think it's because of the recognition of the seriousness of the threat and the consequences of inaction.
That makes a lot of sense. I'd like to wrap up these conversations typically by asking the guest if there is a book that you might be able to recommend to our audience if anybody wants to take a deeper dive into any of these topics. So you already mentioned Team of Teams by General McChrystal. Is there anything else that comes to mind that would be especially relevant to this type of discussion area?
I do have two recommendations, John. The first one I would recommend is called Cyber Warfare, Truth, Tactics, and Strategy by Dr. Chase Cunningham. I happen to serve on the cybersecurity Canon, CANON committee, and we write book reviews of those books that the cybersecurity community should read or not read. And I recently read this book and I did a review for the Canon, and I recommended it for the Canon Hall of Fame. I think I said something in my review to the effect that, this is a book that provides a contemporary PhD level education about a topic that truly has the potential to fundamentally change the way that we perceive our world and as a result, act to combat the dark underbelly of what's increasingly happening in our modern digital age. It's written by an author who's, he's been there and done that he was, working in the US military, was a Navy Master Chief, worked at NSA, worked with intelligence and law enforcement cyber communities, and now with the global, he has current experience across the global industrial cyber landscape. So I think, and what I loved about this book was it broadens the traditional discussion about the cyber topic and includes some really good insight into how traditional cyber tactics and capabilities intersect with modern day tactics and capabilities in the overall information warfare campaigns that are being waged by various adversaries. So it's a book that explains what's happened in today's fast moving and complex age by focusing on recent events, and it looks at the threats behind them and current complementary information warfare trends that present significant challenges for any defense against these dangers. The second book is a book called The Art and Science of Military Deception, edited by Dr. Hy Rothstein and Barton Whaley. First, a warning, this is a thick book, and I'd recommend it only for those who have a serious interest in understanding the full history and evolution of military deception and the important role it's played over time. But of particular interest in terms of cognitive security is the very last chapter about counter-deception planning. And I think in this chapter, you'll find some interesting lessons about best practices in countering deception, which I think have some parallels with the aspect of cognitive security as well.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much for those recommendations. We will have links to those resources in the show notes. And with that, John Davis, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
It was fun, John. I enjoyed it, and I hope that those young information professionals out there really paid attention to that stuff up front. I really mean it, and I wish them the very best of success.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.